I talk about prep a lot, but the podcast is merely just the start of everything that you're creating. And I've got an expert on who's built so many things off of this. You just need to stay tuned. Matty, thanks for coming on board today. You've authored books like the Podcast Guest Playbook. I mean, this is the authority. This is the Podcast Guest Bible here. You host a couple of shows. Originally, you started. Yeah, I kind of figured you would have it handy. I was hoping you would. Most authors aren't like, it's in a distant room. There's a few copies around. That's right. That being said, like you said, you started podcasting because you realized live conversations kind of help refine some of those ideas that like writing alone can't. How did like shifting from like, I know that was probably a shift of a view of yours, being a longtime writer. How did that shift from being a content megaphone to, let's call it the ideal laboratory?
Yeah, well, it developed differently for the two podcasts I have. So one of the podcasts I have is the Indie Author Podcast, definitely writer-centric. That started in 2016 because I had my first book had come out in 2013, and I was trying to tap into all the resources I had to, do the best by that book, and I was working on the next books. And so I was a member of a local writers group called the Brandywine Valley Writers Group. And I wanted an opportunity to talk to all the people in that group who had expertise that I wanted to tap into. So, for example, there was someone who was very good at author readings. There was someone else who was very good at like media outreach. There was another person who had kind of formed a writer co-op to create a publishing organization with some fellow writers. And I wanted an opportunity to talk to all these people. And almost as a courtesy, I recorded those conversations as the first episodes of the Indie Author Podcast, and I put them up whenever I had a conversation very, very irregularly. And so my first podcast was really a matter of me collecting information and then just kind of sharing it out as a courtesy to my fellow writers group members and to fellow writers everywhere. But when I spun up my second podcast, the From Expertise to Authority with Matty Dalrymple, at the end of last year, I had a different goal for that because I had been doing consulting with writers about helping them understand their goals, their creative goals, their business goals, and then crafting a plan to help them meet those. And when I spun that up, I was expecting a lot of consulting clients who would come to me and say, I've written a book. What should I do with it now? But instead, I was finding I was getting sort of a cohort of consultees who already had a book, generally people who were retiring or who were spinning up a side hustle. And they said, I have this book now. What should I do with it? And so I realized that as I spoke to them, a lot of the things that we were talking about, I had written about. I had a book about co-authoring nonfiction. I had a book about podcasting as both a host and a guest. I had a book about book marketing. And so I realized that I didn't need to focus specifically on people who I initially identified as writers. I could focus more broadly on people who were professionals who were heading into the sideline or second act. And I wanted to talk to them because I crystallized all the ideas I could through my own experience as someone who had done that. But then I realized that I needed to have conversations with other people to get other perspectives and sort of tap into their angles. And so that was the background of From Expertise to Authority. It was still a learning experience for me because I was still taking that information in and gaining those additional perspectives. And then I was able to feed that back out in different formats, like articles, or eventually like a book, or podcast conversation. So I realized that it's a whole ecosystem of content development, content creation, and content sharing. And podcasting is a great sort of foundational stone in that content building structure.
100% makes sense. And I kind of want to go back a little bit to something you said, because I love your use of really the tapping into the experts here. Was there anyone that you can go back and think of that kind of shook your foundation in terms of like, oh, I didn't look at it that way?
Well, I'll tell the story of the background of one of the books, which was podcast based. And that is that when I have 2 suspense and thriller series. And when I got the idea for the second series, I wanted to keep providing some engaging content to fans of the first series while I worked on the second series. And so I started writing a series of short stories that were based on the first series characters. And I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, which is Mark Lefebvre's Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing. And Mark made a very brief mention in one of his episodes about how you can use short fiction. It was beyond the sort of craft tips. It was the business side of short fiction. And so as a fan of his podcast, as a supporter, a patron of his podcast, I sent him a note and I said, oh, this is great. I'd love to hear a whole episode that's based on what you can do with short fiction. And so Mark Lefebvre, being who he is, he immediately delivered an episode on exactly that topic. And I got in touch with him again and I said, I think there's enough here that's the basis for a book. Would you be willing to co-author a book with me? And co-authoring, there are a couple of benefits to that. One is that Mark is a very, very visible and well-respected member of the indie author community. So having a connection with him, an official connection in the form of a book, was very appealing. I had a lot of experience with indie publishing my short fiction, but Mark had a ton of experience in the traditional short fiction world. And so he could bring, again, a whole perspective that was kind of beyond what I had. And so I was being able to tap into his audience and his knowledge to benefit myself and to benefit the other people who are interested in short fiction. And so, again, the podcast was the kernel of that relationship. And since then, Mark and I have mutually been on each other's podcasts over and over again. In fact, whenever I hit a 100 mark with the Indie Author podcast, I invite Mark back for a landmark episode to mark a 100th episode. So that experience, first as a podcast listener and then later as a podcast host, was a huge aha for me. I think that was the first time where I really saw how all these relationships and all these platforms could work together in that way.
It makes sense. And I totally see that. And that kind of segues into what I was actually really wanted to talk about next, because you talk about like the best podcast strategy. And I agree with you totally on this. Isn't just hosting. It's not just guesting, but it's intentionally combining both of those into an ecosystem that's going to feed multiple platforms. And obviously for you, I mean, I know it feeds all the typicals like the LinkedIns, the socials, the things of that nature. But obviously, you've already talked about it, how it feeds the paper platforms too.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that? So like, is there a workflow that you have that is every podcast goes through this to this to this to this? Or how do you assemble that in a way that's productive for you?
Well, I will use, in this case, the From Expertise to Authority podcast as an example. And what I found has been very helpful for me is that oftentimes just in the course of my day, in the course of my work, I'll encounter someone and I'll find out they started out as someone in the medical field, and then they spun up a company that creates AI generated audio for authors. That's Phil Marshall. Or I'll find out someone who started out as someone who was personally very interested in fitness and kind of parlayed that into a whole profession. That's Mike Kuzala. And I'll say, oh, I want to talk about that. Will you come on the podcast and talk with me about that? And we'll record the podcast. I have a standard list of questions I ask. And so the interesting part isn't really the questions I ask, it's the responses that they elicit. And then when I'm done, I create a transcript from that conversation. And a lot of times what I find is helpful is to feed the transcript into an AI like Claude or ChatGPT and say, I was really interested in this particular topic that we delved into. Like, let's say one of the topics I recall is that when you become an expert and an authority in a certain area, it doesn't mean you become expert and authoritative in all related areas. So you might be an expert at sharing information about the importance of fitness in the classroom, but now you want to develop expertise and authority in presenting that as a keynote in large gatherings. And so I'll say this idea of you don't become an expert in all things at all times. That's interesting to me. Let's talk about that. And I'll talk about that after I've talked about it with the human. I'll continue delving into it with the AI. And oftentimes it's very useful in helping me identify, this seems related to this other thing you've already talked about, or this seems foundational, or this seems like a little tangential. Is there another angle we could take that makes it more relatable to the body of work? And so then the results of that can be, and I don't generate the results from the AI. I'm using the AI to brainstorm, and then I generate the results myself. And that could be an article. It could be an article I publish on Substack. It might be an article I pitch to another platform. It could be a chapter in a book. It could be identifying a whole other book I want to write about. And so just making the most of those conversations that you have in the podcast environment, and then seeing all the other ways you can use them. I mean, I'm very active on Substack now, and one of the things I enjoy doing is publishing transcripts, but then asking AI to pick out quotes from the transcript that I can then link to in Substack and draw people to the article. So again, it's not an isolated thing, it's an ecosystem of content.
That's a wonderful way to do it. And I find it interesting, are you having actual conversations with the AI? Because that's something that, the other morning walking the dog, I've got my earbuds in, and I mean, one of my neighbors, I'm sure, as they see me walking through the neighborhood, is he's probably just on the phone, not realizing I'm talking to a computer. But yeah. So you're having the conversations about it afterwards then?
Yeah, it's just an opportunity. If I had a person I could have the conversation that would be great. But I don't have anyone who really wants to spend an hour with me delving into the significance of a couple of sentences in a conversation. And so, yeah, I'll say, this seems interesting. Here's what I'm thinking. And it's a great sounding board. You can say, does this connection make sense? And if you've prompted it not to be sycophantic, then it will, you can get it to say what it really thinks. And sometimes the ideas are great and trigger other thoughts from me. Sometimes they're terrible. I mean, I think it's becoming more and more clear both how powerful AI can be and how limited it can be in some ways. And so always having a human driver at the wheel is super important. And I think that the more conversational you can make it, then the more you're using the AI as a stand-in for the people that you want to have that conversation with.
Yeah, 100% makes sense. I totally see that. In that, there's a lot of people, and I'm sure you've seen it too, where they're focusing on the vanity, like download numbers, and I'm sure there's some book sale numbers. You focus on turning all of this into a long-term asset. Is that what, first off, is that why you're doing the Substack and things of that nature, is to build that library? And second off, is that what you're using, the podcast as your base, as your kind of, let's call it your expertise generator for what you're doing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in full transparency, my hope is that someone will listen to our conversation and be intrigued by what I have to say, and they will decide to pick up my book or check out my website and explore my consulting opportunities, or maybe an event organizer will hear this and decide they want to bring me on as a speaker for an event. And so the podcast conversations and honestly the books are really my calling cards to those kinds of opportunities. And I should actually run the numbers, but I'm pretty sure that I've made more in speaking fees from topics I've addressed at conferences and in educational events than I have from the books. But those were opportunities I wouldn't have gotten if I couldn't have said, I've thought about this deeply enough that I've written an entire book's worth of content about it that you can check out, I'll send them the book for free if they want to check it out. And so it is both. It's like an entree to those opportunities and a way to continue thinking through my ideas, like even about things like I've been writing and talking about podcast guesting for a long time. And I still have conversations, especially with other podcasters, where I'm like, I never thought about it that way. And so, it's still a learning opportunity.
It's one of the reasons why I still love doing this podcast, because it seems like, this is what I do 60, 70, 150 hours a week.
Yeah.
But still, like, having these conversations, it always seems to be like I'm learning something from it. And it's what I truly love about it.
Yeah.
Speaking of learning, you said that your biggest lesson in podcasting is that the podcast shouldn't be the final destination.
Right.
Can you share? I mean, I know you talked about some of the speaking gigs and stuff like that. Has there been other things that have come from the podcast where you're like, whoa, where did that come from?
Yeah, well, I think the community building aspect. So one of the things that I always try to emphasize to people when I'm speaking on the topic or I'm consulting with people about it is that if you think about the landing an interview as the end result, then you are so greatly reducing the benefits that both you and your host can gain from that. And so I think about the people that I have been fortunate enough to have as guests on my podcast and the relationships that I've built up with them. Like, for all the biggest names in the indie author space, I can drop them an email and they will, so to speak, take my call because, we've built that relationship. Mark is a perfect example. Another example is Michael Laron. Michael and I've now co-authored 2 books with Mark Lefebvre. I've co-authored 2 books with Michael Laron. I'm good friends with Dale Roberts now as a result of mutual podcast appearances. And Dale is like the king of YouTube for authors. And so whenever I have a question about YouTube, I can call up Dale and say, Dale, I need some help with this. And so the true benefit you get from a podcast appearance, and all those examples work the other way. It works when you're a guest and it works when you're a host. And if you continue to look for opportunities to serve the host, if you're a guest, then, the good karma comes back to help you. And so, I always advise people to continue keeping touch in a thoughtful way with the people whose podcasts they've been on, to continue supporting them on social media, to just stay in touch, assuming it was a good experience, because, it's going to open up many, many more opportunities than just that 30-minute or 45-minute conversation that you had one time.
The opportunities that being in podcasting have given me have been truly, truly amazing. The people that I've worked with, the people that I've talked to, both on the production side and sitting in front of them. Just absolutely amazing. So I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. As you've mentioned AI, obviously you're working with it too. We work with it quite a bit. It's a subject I always like to talk about because in some cases I see it making things so much easier, so much more productive, and so much better. In other cases, it is an angry elephant in the room that's about ready to step on us all. What do you see as the future of, and I'd really, because of your perspective, I don't just want to talk about podcasting. I kind of like to talk about content as a whole, because obviously being an author is a big part of things for you too. Yeah.
Well, I don't use AI for my own creative writing, and I never try to convince other people to do that. I do, however, convince especially indie authors to consider it for the business side of their work, because I just think that there are some things, like, I don't think anybody's going to be angry when they find out that I heavily rely on AI to write the sales descriptions for my books that show up on retail sites, because that is just a different kind of writing that is not my area of expertise. I don't think anyone expects an author who's published by a traditional publisher. I don't believe anyone is expecting they're writing their own descriptions. And it's just a better experience for everybody, me and the browser, if I go on to ChatGPT or Claude and say, I want you to take a look at the descriptions of other popular books in this genre, other successful books in this genre, and I want you to give me a draft that mimics those. I want you to call out the tropes. I mean, this is a great example. I wrote, before the advent of AI, I wrote my own sales descriptions for a while. They were fine, but they weren't great. And one thing that I had never included were the tropes and the stories. And so a lot of times you'll see in a sales description, it'll say, perfect for readers who love found family and ticking time bomb. And so one of the times that I fed my book into AI and asked it to generate a sales description for me, it suggested that. And I was like, you know what? I should have done that. It never occurred to me. And so I think that for those more business related things, it's indispensable. I will say that, kind of bringing it back to podcasting, one of the challenges is that it has also made creating enormous amounts of content super easy and freakishly personalized content. And so I'm sure that you have gotten like 1,000,004 pitches that say, name. I loved your last episode with name, about name, where you talked about topic, and just on and on and on. And so for many years, I would give presentations at writers' events about podcast guesting, and I would share a successful pitch template that had worked well for me that you could send via email. And then last year, I guess, I was a couple of days away from giving a presentation that I'd given many times before, and I was going through it to make any little final tweaks, and I got to that part about the pitch email template, and I was like, I just can't keep telling people to do this, because nobody's looking at, like, podcast hosts. I won't speak for you, but if an email comes from Gmail and it starts out with a freakishly specific reference to my podcast, I ignore it. And I feel bad because I'm sure I'm ignoring some legitimate pitches, but it's one of the, I'll put in a pitch for Podmatch, which is where you and I met, that using a service, Podmatch, or, there are many others out there, where you are going somewhere where people are actually looking for guests.
Yes.
I think is the way to go now, because you want to be where people are actually looking for what you have to offer. And so that is a fairly easy way to get around this challenge of the enormous tsunami of AI-generated stuff that's landing in our email boxes.
I love the pause before you said stuff. That to me says it all about your intentions with that. In this, as we start to kind of wrap up here, one of my favorite things to always talk with people about is, I mean, you've done this for a while. Like, we have all learned these lessons where we're like, oh, that was a big one. What is a big lesson about podcasting that you have learned that you're like, yeah, other people shouldn't have to learn this lesson too?
I think that the biggest lesson I learned is to start small. And so when I was first spinning up my podcast, I was trying to do all the good things, right? All the good things. Like, it was an era where transcripts were just kind of starting to come out, and there were AI tools that generated transcripts, but they were not very good. And so they required a lot of editing. And I started doing everything. I would provide the transcript. I was putting it up on YouTube. I was trying to do all the things. And the transcript is a perfect example, because at some point, I was spending probably a couple of hours editing a transcript for a 35 to 45 minute interview. And it just wasn't feasible. And so I went, over the course of the podcast, I've probably introduced and withdrawn transcripts several times based on the time I had to do it. And if I had never provided a transcript, I don't think anybody would have complained. But once I did it and then withdrew it, it seemed like I was reducing the value that I was providing. And so I just think that the lesson to start small, and, podcasts are still, video is very popular, but they are still an audio first platform. And so making sure you're putting out good quality audio, hopefully regularly, and just loop back later. Like, you don't need to start out with a logo. You don't need to start out with a website. You don't need to start out with all the things. And that's especially important if you start hosting a podcast and you find it's not for you. Like, you don't want to have invested all this time and money in something that isn't sustainable. So yeah, start small and build up when you know that you have the bandwidth and the wherewithal in order to provide additional value to your listeners.
Truly great advice. And I think we've all seen the podcasts that start out. I mean, we all know that I think it's up to like 90% of podcasts don't make it past episode 15 now. Yeah. And it's because if you start out doing everything and trying to learn everything at once, it is overwhelming. There's a lot. There's a reason why we have an industry around this instead of it's just everyone in closets recording. That being said, you truly, I mean, a wealth of knowledge. I've enjoyed this, and I love how you tie it in with so many other things. Where can people find you? Where can people learn more about you?
Well, thank you so much. This has been so fun. And if people would like to learn more about me, they can go to the indieauthor.com, and that's indie with a Y, INDY. And there they can find my 2 books about podcasting, my consulting service to help prepare, especially writers, for their first podcast guest appearances. That's called Pod Pro Author Coaching. And they can find out more about From Expertise to Authority.
Wonderful. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. For everyone else, I will be right back. I've got some good notes today. Imagine that. Stay tuned. This is one of the things that I truly love about podcasting, because Matty and I probably wouldn't have a conversation just out on the street. But to have the opportunity to take someone that has her experience in this breadth of things, and it's in a different area than most of us are typically in. She's really found a way to leverage the podcast in a bunch of different ways, and then to bring AI in that while still being a writer and while taking a lot of pride in her writing. She's still using the AI tools in a bunch of great ways. So to me, it's such a unique thing to find someone like that truly grateful for the conversation. With that, I've got 3 main points that I want to cover today. When it comes to podcasting, know your lane. And really, this comes to like anything that you're in. Know where you're good, know where you're bad. Focus on making sure that you are doing the things that you are good at. I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's something that so many of us lose sight of in so many cases. Focus on what you're good on. If you can find someone else to cover the stuff that you're not as good on, it's a great way to do it. The second thing that I want to talk about, and this one seems just way too obvious, it's not just about the podcast. I mean, she's used the podcast to create books, then the Substack. And I love her thought process behind that, of how to make it different. Like she takes these ideas from the podcast, she talks through them with AI, and then says, here is what I'm going to create for what I learned from this podcast. It's absolutely a brilliant way to do this, because in so many cases, if you listen to the podcast and read the Substack or blog, they're too close to each other almost. If you saw one or read the one, you kind of know what the other one is. This creates so much more value with just a simple conversation that she has. I truly love it. What a phenomenal idea with that. The last piece that I want to cover, you need to start small. Work on what you can. Get good at one thing before you try and move on to the next. And this is something else that so many people just try and dive in and get good at everything at one time. No. Once again, we always talk, your first couple of podcasts are not going to get that many views. So make sure that you're good at the audio. Make sure that you're good at the recording process. Then start to work on the editing. add pieces that you're going to work on in steps. You don't think you're going to release this highly polished production the first time out. We have a team. There's a number of specialists that work within our team that help us to create a polished output. Either A, find specialists, or B, pick one thing at a time to start to get good at. You can't just work on all the skills at the same time. To me, brilliant advice. And I'm so glad I had the conversation with Matty today. With all that being said, if you think someone else needs to hear this conversation, do me a favor, share it with them. If you'd like to be a guest, by all means, reach out. Would love to probably have you on the show. And as always, do me a favor, take care of yourself. If you can, take care of yourself. How did I mess that one up after as many times as I've said that? Nonetheless, let's try this again. Do me a favor, take care of yourself. If you can, take care of someone else too. I will see you very, very soon.